One day, a family on holiday passed by a farmhouse. So they stopped to check if they could rent a room for the night. So the father stepped out, he rang the bell, and the elder lady opened and, well, he asked, "Ma'am, me and my family, we wanna rent a room for the night." And elder woman told them, "Oh, yeah, you can. Just come in." They parked the car at the side of the road and they paid $50 and they went in. The elder lady pointed them upstairs to three rooms that they could accommodate that night. So the family was happy. The next morning, however, when they were looking for the elder lady, she was nowhere to be found. So they thought, this is quite weird. Where did the old lady go? Why? Because they want to stay at the farm for a longer period of time. So they thought, okay, we're just going to stay for a while here. In the second night, however, the wife became ill. And she told the husband that she sensed a bad smell. The husband didn't sense anything, but the children did. So the husband went onto the land, and there he noticed that there were almost no livestock at all. He only saw a few cows wandering around. And he thought, this is quite weird. This is a big property. Where are all the cows? He then looked at some of the crops, and he noticed that the crops looked a bit. The crops didn't look very well. And the more he walked on the land, he began to sense this smell of death around there. So he arrived at the ditch because the farm had ditches around it to mark the end of the property. When he arrived at the ditch, man, the smell was overwhelming. He couldn't even come near the ditch. But then he saw that there were organs of dead cows floating around in the ditch. And he saw some skeletons also floating around. And he was thinking, what kind of horror crap is this? He went back to the farmhouse and told his family they were leaving right away. So they left. And in the nearby town, the town nearby, they went to a doctor. And the doctor told them that, well, that his wife was had food poisoning because she ate rotten fruit, and that the children needed to take medication because they they inhaled toxic air. So they were rushed to hospital where they received help, and then the doctor had to ask the father what happened. So the father told the doctor about this farmhouse he went to. And then the doctor asked him, where is that farmhouse again? So the father explained. Then the doctor looked weird at him, and the husband asked, what's going on? And the doctor told them, that farmhouse, I used to go there when I was 12 years old. There was this woman living over there. Her husband passed away. When her husband passed away, her sons also moved out. So she only had a few employees working for her on the farm. After a while, the farm became toxic. The livestock began to die off, and the land became unproductive. They tried to sell the farm many times, but nobody wants to purchase it because the ground has become poisoned. Any crop that grows on that soil is poisoned. And even coming near that house is risky for your health. And some people were telling me that that old lady passed away years ago. So then the father was thinking, what? She passed away years ago? The doctor, at least that's what I heard. Please, never go to that farm again. Now what happened at that farm? Normally, when a young calf falls into a ditch, it's pulled out. In this case, the elderly woman told the employees just leave the darn calf in the ditch. So they did. But here's the thing. It wasn't only that calf that drowned into the ditch. There were old cows, I mean those grown cows that were wandering around that fell into the ditch during the raining season when there was a lot of rain. And those cows drowned. And they were floating around. So the employees knew that um, their employer, the widow, had no intention of cleaning up and doing what was needed. So they picked rocks and they laid rocks on the corpses of those cows and they sunk to the bottom of the ditch. Why? Because employees thought it was frightened to see dead cows floating around on the ditches. So they did it. But this intoxicated the whole farm. One of the employers even died of an infection while being at the farm. Now, this is a parable, as you know. Look, what I'm making plain with this is that any farmer in his right mind or her right mind would pull out that cattle from a ditch. First of all, ditches aren't deep. They aren't that deep. They're just there to mark the property, and sometimes they're there as a water provision. So it's unlikely that a cow would drown in a ditch. Now, I'm not saying it can't happen. It can happen, but even if it happens, the corpses would float around. They would not go to the bottom. So the phrase, yeah, this saying in the Netherlands and in Dutch-speaking communities, geen oude koeien uit de sloot halen. Translated in English, it means never pull old cows from the ditch, or they rephrase it differently, getting old cows from the ditch. First of all, if there's an if there's a cow that was at the bottom of a ditch, well, that's a sign that something is wrong because normally the corpse would float around. You could see that. If they're at the bottom, it means they have been on purpose sunk to the bottom, so nobody would notice them. And another thing, farmers that have livestock count their livestock because livestock is expensive. So if an animal is missing, they will go and look for it, and they will find it. So even the saying is not an historically practical thing. What does this saying gathering old cows from the dish reveal? And I'm sure in other languages they have other variants of it, where they use other animals as a parable. It comes down to the following. In the world, there is this tendency to, how do I say, to suppress past information, not positive, no, not, I don't want to call it past information. When things happen that shouldn't have happened, people often bury it in order to move on, in order to get over it. Now look, it's not wise to keep dwelling on things that happened in the past. That's not a wise thing to do. So that's not what I'm promoting, nor what I'm suggesting here. There is another trap, however, when you keep suppressing, I'm saying repressing things, I'm saying the knowledge of things that happened in the past. And often when the knowledge keeps resurfacing, it's because it's something that needs to be dealt with. In this case, in the parable I just gave, the cows were floating around. So that was a sign that something was happening. But they buried them by throwing rocks at them and they sunk to the bottom of the ditch. so nobody saw them. But the smell came up, and people thought, well, it's just from the, let's say it. Most people thought it came from the defecation of the cows and the other livestock. We thought, well, farms ought to smell a bit stinking. It's common. So they didn't notice that the smell that came up over and over again was a sign that there was something beneath that needed to be addressed. Until the whole farm was intoxicated and it became dangerous to even be around. Look, for example, let me give an example. Let's say that you have a couple, a married couple, and one of the couples cheated uh, early in the marriage. Then, if later they decided to move on past it, then they need to go through healing and recovery of the betrayal in order for the marriage to continue to function. But they cannot expect that the cheating happened, they just forget all about it, any knowledge of it, and they move on as if nothing ever happened. They shouldn't keep the wound alive, but keep mentioning it in the negative either. But to just bury it like that, that's not a wise thing to do. I'm not a marriage counselor, I'm just pointing out that if a traumatic historic fact happened, just burying it is not a good idea. It's not a good idea at all. It may give relief and a short-term benefit, but that cancels itself out by the long-term sorrow that comes with it. The same thing with people that become alcoholic. When they drink, the knowledge of some danger is suppressed. The emotional roots, the emotional harm is suppressed. And they also have other people like them who are drinking, so they have company, so they're relieved. But that short-term benefit, which often only lasts for a few hours, has long-term sorrow attached to it. Now look, there are people who only want to mention bad facts that happen and have no intention of moving on. Now such people are traps. They are traps, so it's wise for you to avoid them. To even avoid speaking with them, because speaking with them itself is a trap. So if you are staying away or keeping such people at a distance, you're doing the right thing. However, to just bury things also is not a wise thing to do. As I mentioned before, no farmer in his or her right mind would allow drowned cattle to float around in the ditches. And they especially would not throw rocks on them to make them sink to the bottom so that everything appears well. But what if I told you that that is the common attitude in the world when it comes to daily life, especially when it comes to spiritual stuff? What if I told you that it's the default way of operating by worldly people? The default way of operating in the world is by throwing rocks on a drowned cattle in order for it to sink to the bottom so that the trench remains still. Because that's what people want. They want things to remain still. They want to have relief. They want daily life to keep functioning. They want society to keep moving on. People tell you to move on, get over it. Stop mentioning it. And that's what people want. And indeed, it brings relief. But at a high cost. And when the higher costs begin to manifest itself, people will cover that also. Until it becomes too much and people have to run away because it has become unlivable, uninhabitable. Look, I'm not, how to say it, I'm not a therapist. I don't have any therapist certifications. So I'm not here to give you advice how to deal with emotional turmoil and all of that. I'm just pointing out to you from a spiritual perspective, because it's spiritual knowledge I'm sharing on this channel. From a spiritual perspective, you need to deal with the root of stuff. And worldly people that know nothing about the spiritual realm, of course they are traps. Of course they are pushing drowned cattle in the ditch. Of course they do that. They have no other option because pulling out the cows from the ditch out of ground is not an easy thing. And if they do it, sometimes things, well, they still have to deal with the drowned cow then. And often they're not prepared or capable of handling that. So that's worldly people with no understanding of the spiritual whatsoever. There are some people in the world that have spiritual understanding, but they operate in the paranormal, so they're still trapped. But about believers, there are many believers who lack understanding. There are many believers who operate by worldly wisdom, by humanistic knowledge. Now, humanistic knowledge has its place in the humanistic realm. Worldly understanding has its place when doing practical things in the world, only to a certain extent. However, as a believer, you ought to realize that you ought to operate in the Spirit in agreement with Christ. But a lot of believers don't do this. They're still holding on to the good practical methods of the world. Even though those good practical methods are indeed practical methods that do bring relief and kind of good, but the good is short-lived. Now, the Heavenly Father wants us to operate in the Spirit, to have victory, to be delivered instead of only relieved. Let me give a short illustration, very short. Let's say you have a girl of 14 years old that walks away from home and she stays away from home. She takes on another name and she lives on. She gets married at 23 and 25 she has a baby. Now her husband knows that she ran away from home and all of that. She told him everything when they were dating. Then the husband told his wife, you know, honey, it may be a good idea to reconcile with your parents because your children need to have grandparents and all of that. And then the wife told him, honey, don't worry about it. Then the husband told her, but dear, you are getting old cows out of the ditch. And then she told her husband, honey, when I was a young kid, I was terrified of being around my father. When that man would not have his way, he would become a furious animal. He would rage, and you had to run away because someone would get hurt. And that mother of mine, she tolerated it. She kept sleeping with the guy. She kept pretending as if nothing was going on. And not only that, my father had buddies that grew up with him. They also knew about his temper. They kind of, well, ignored it. The people at the workplace ignored it. The whole community ignored it. Even the pastors ignored it. That man was a danger for his family. He was dangerous to be around. That man had no intention of seeking help. And no 10-year-old has to be terrified in their own house because one of the parents might think something bad and act out without any reason. You know what? I left that community for a reason. And the reason is simple. I needed to be safe. And those people did not care about my safety. It would be something different if they didn't know any better. There are times people don't know any better. And I can't blame people when they don't know any better. But in my case, people knew better. They just hit the old cows in the ditch. And the whole ditch became poisoned. And I left that ditch. And you know what? I went to that town a few times, past years, and let me tell you, the people there have not changed. Some people recognized me when I was there. Some old friends who knew what was going on. Some of the friends I told that I would run away. Those friends even that recognized me were surprised to see me there. They even asked me why I came back over there. So I informed about my parents, and they were still in behaving the same way. My older siblings moved out of the house, but often they came back, and but I found out that everyone was speaking bad about me, blaming me that I brought harm on the family, that I hurt at my parents, all of that. Nobody spoke a word about all the harm they agreed upon me by permitting and allowing things to happen that should have never happened. It's the community's responsibility as a collective to keep their members in check and to provide safety for all members, especially towards the children and the vulnerable people of the community. So I'm not living in the past. I'm I'm over what happened. That does not mean that I'm going to endanger myself again. And honey, you want me to endanger our children by bringing them to those reprobates? Honey, I love you, but you're out of your mind now. Then the husband thought, you know what, dear, you're telling the truth. Forgive me what I suggested. Now look, when you are faced with stuff, you always walk by faith. Walking by faith should be your default operation as a believer. So let me say it like this. In the parable I just gave unto you, this young woman fled, so she had to leave. She was gone. She was out of there, but she was not delivered. She had to leave from those people and their parents. And she said she was over it. What she meant was she was done dealing with the issue. And she was right. But here's the thing, she went back to the community a few times because she still hoped that somewhere things could be resolved later on. But she realized that it was a trap. She realized that those people, they agreed to remain in darkness. They made darkness their habitation. So to have one of those people around is to invite darkness. So she realized that she couldn't get along with those people. So that's why she didn't want to speak about it. It's only that now that her husband kept putting pressure on it, she confessed that she went back and all of that. Now look, that's the best scenario when it comes to worldly people. But most of the time, worldly people don't get this. They don't. They go to therapy year after year, or to counseling year after year, and they keep being wounded and drained and life sucked out of them because they just can't figure out what's going on, because they never look at the bigger picture. In the parable I just gave unto you, this teenage girl saw the bigger picture. When she was older, she thought that maybe she was wrong. She went back, but then confirmation came that she was right all along. Now, as a believer, you don't live a lifestyle of fleeing away, of running away. You overcome by faith. And of course, there are circumstances you walk away from. That's wise. But even then, you operate by faith. You deal with violence at its paranormal roots instead of by your own understanding. So, believers should not have old cows in the ditch, because with us, there are no ditches, because we operate by faith, we operate in freedom. So there's no ditch for them for issues to fall into. Because when issues arrive, we walk by faith, we speak to the circumstance by faith, and things happen. Maybe not the way we expect, but things happen. We speak to the storm. We walk on the troubled waters of life. I'm not speaking literally here, but you get what I'm saying here. We walk on the troubled seas. We speak to the storms that come upon us. We speak to the strongholds and tear them down in the name of the Messiah. So we are operating in the supernatural. And for those who are believers, operate in the supernatural. Always. That being said, be at peace and keep agreeing with Christ.